So thank you all for hanging in to the last panel of the day. It looked a little earlier today. It looked kind of like the baggage claim area of an airport, and it's looking a little less like that. So thank you all for sticking in. Anita, you want to do the introduction?
So maybe this is more the people who have to stay over at the terminal. I don't know. How's everybody doing? I've been having some conversations, and people's levels of energy are flagging, depending on how close to Juliana they're sitting. So we hope that we can keep up the energy for this last bit. We're going to take an hour rather than an hour 15 minutes, and afterwards Hilke is going to close. So that's the format here. We will ask a few questions of our panelists. All of them, this is like, the pick of the litter. No, I'm kidding. All the panelists were great. But we got panelists from the past few days with different backgrounds, with different levels of involvement in STM, some complete, wonderful newcomers to our community, others old hats like Todd and me, and sort of everyone in between. So we would like this to be an interactive session again, but we'll start with a couple of comments from the panelists. I just want to start by saying thank you all so very much. This has been an incredibly fun conference to help put together, and I think the energy and the conversations have been really fantastic. And I just want to thank absolutely everyone, because all the conversations I've been part of, everybody feels very like something is changing and we're part of it. And I think that's exactly what we were hoping to enable in these days. So thank you again so much. So I'm just going to ask very simply, going down, starting with Juliana and then moving down, if you could just say a couple of things that really struck you about the past few days. What are some things that you would like to say? Thanks.
Well, first of all, I'm glad that we have all solved FAIR so that we don't have to talk about it anymore, and AI has come to take its place. So we now have a new topic of conversation. I think these days have been interesting because A, I work from home and I'm under-socialized, and B, this isn't really my crowd. I'm tangentially in Scalcom as someone who looked after metadata and data. But so thank you for the welcome, because it's been great. I think one thing I found really interesting was the emphasis on community and the fact that it does take a wide range of people to get research outputs into the world in a way that makes sense to people. I always tell people never FAIR alone, because if you want to do things that are fair, you need research engineers, you need research computing, you need curators, librarians, scientists, and we all need to cooperate. And I think the same is true with publishing. And that seems to have come forth here. There's a lot of actors in this space, and I think it's great that we're having conversations about what we're trying to do collectively.
Right. So I'm a newcomer. So for me, this was the first time. I never heard of STM before. And I haven't attended all sessions. So I could try to be a politician. And I was encouraged to say whatever I want to say.
Yes.
And things that may resonate with me. I think you're all afraid of AI and what it will do, and rightfully so. It is a disruptive moment. I think a few things seem to be missing that I found in the conversation. Like maybe not. I really appreciated the two sessions this afternoon. And also the sessions yesterday, including the one that I was part of. But the things that are missing, for instance, there are a lot of people in the reality of publishing and academic publishing who are not the traditional scientists. For instance, you probably all know that the majority of the people who get a PhD don't go into academia. Now, they still have data that they need to publish, And what are you going to do about it if suddenly the person loses any interest in publishing, but there's a very, very valuable data? So that's one example. How do we navigate that uncertainty with or without AI? The other one is, what do you do with groups that involve real people, not paper mills, but not traditional people? In a sense, for instance, there is a great push in social sciences to be more inclusive in Canada and in New Zealand, to some extent here as well. I work in a cross-cultural space. I have some colleagues who are indigenous stakeholders in South America, for instance. They don't have an email. They don't even have a radio. They have to go to another village to get a radio. So how are you supposed to verify them? And given that we have sort of like greater push for multi-author papers, where everybody has to sign up and verify. I mean, those type of conversations, I seem to they were kind of maybe missing this time. But again, I haven't been at the prior STM meeting, so in the spirit of intellectual humility, I don't know. Maybe you guys have discussed that at length before. The last thing I would say, and then I'll shut up, is that I totally get that publishers are very interested in protecting their intellectual property. I totally get it. But as a scientist, it is so excruciatingly painful. It's really painful to go from one platform to another and lose everything that was done in one platform when you have to transfer your manuscript to another. If you're part of a Springer Nature, you're fine within the ecosystem. You transfer to Elsevier, you have to start from scratch. That's the type of friction. I talked about friction. My colleague talked about friction yesterday. That is so unnecessary. And we have the tools to do better. And now is probably the moment to do better, because it is a disruptive moment, because you have to rethink everything about how a paper will look like. The whole system, as was mentioned this morning. So maybe this would be a moment to kind of get back together and not, I understand intellectual property, it's a business and you want to protect your business, especially in a time of uncertainty like right now. But maybe it's also a moment to appeal to our shared humanity and think that the reason why we are all in this business is not just for profit, but to benefit the common good.
Thank you. I'm going to start with an apology, because instead of sharing a well thought out set of reflections, you're going to get some paranoid musings from a very sleep deprived mind. So I've been sort of worrying about a couple of things, and I'll put them into two buckets. One is I'll call Frankenstein future, and the other unintended consequences. So none of us really know what the future holds. Igor made it very clear that us humans, we are fairly rubbish at predicting the future. But we do know, say, for example, moving to OA, that different groups are going to move at different speeds, and different groups will imagine different outcomes and endpoints that are favorable to them. And they may assume that that endpoint is also being imagined by every other stakeholder, because what's good for me is obviously good for everyone. And that's not always the case. And I don't know if you were at school, you used to play a game that you're meant to draw a human. So one person draws a head, folds over the paper, the next person draws a neck, folds over the paper, torso, and in the end you get this Frankenstein. And that's what we need to avoid, is to make sure that we do speak to each other and collaborate and make sure that whatever the future holds, we're not going to get some Panglossian, all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, but we should at least be aware of what best means for us isn't going to be best for all parties, and just make sure we are trying to work for some kind of common good. So that's one, the Frankenstein future. Let's not do that. The other is unintended consequences. I think, the path we're all on, we can see lots of unintended consequences. And to take the example of, we know that we're going to start having more emphasis on measuring types of impact that aren't scholarly impact, societal benefit, for example. And we know that this isn't new. We've been trying to do this for a long time. The reason we haven't done it is because it's hard. So let's learn from past mistakes and make sure whatever we put in place, we are very careful what we measure, what kind of incentives we're putting in place. So let's have a really good balance of qualitative measures, quantitative measures, and not rely on single point metrics again.
So I worked for many years as a rare books librarian. And so we were asked to talk about today about the future and what the future looks like in 10 years. So I'm going to start in the year 1545. There was a real crisis in intellectual faith in the 1540s because there was a realization that more books had been printed than people would be able to read in their lifetime. And in the year 1545, a scholar named Conrad Gesner published a book called the Bibliotheca Universalis, a book of books, essentially, in which he tried to codify and capture everything that had been published to date. And in the introduction, he lamented the confusing and harmful abundance of books and suggested that societies of learned individuals come together to solve this problem. And in fact, 500 years later, that's exactly what we are doing in this meeting, it strikes me. But what this crisis provoked was a real flourishing in printing, because people worked together from different paths of life, and particularly from different educational paths. And at the time, this included printers, but also scientists who were interested in thinking about how concepts like taxonomies and indices could be printed better in books, but also really artists who were thinking about how to visualize this content in different ways. And these people worked together, and it became a real point of flourishing for the publication industry. I think this is relevant to us because printing at this point was not new. It was 100 years old. It was essentially a transformative technology, as it had been 100 years ago. But at the time, in the 1540s, it had become an enabling technology. And I think a lot of what we have been talking about today and yesterday is the difference and what we need to clarify of what are enabling technologies. So what are still print-based processes that we are thinking about that need to move into the digital realm and may or may not use generative AI to improve, as opposed to transformative technologies. And several of us have talked about this, including in Igor's remarks. What does this look like, a born digital or a digital native ecosystem of publishing, and how do we get there? And so I think that's a really interesting thing for us to all keep thinking about and keep talking about.
So moving on to the next set of questions for the panel, want to think about the question of diversity and who's involved in these conversations. This was really highlighted, I think, best in the trust panel earlier, where we as an industry are faced with a problem of research integrity and people trying to game a system, but we are only part of that system. And I think it's important to recognize that if we want to solve some of these problems, solving some of those problems is going to have to extend outside of this room. And by that, I don't just mean the couple hundred people who were here at this conference, who attend Frankfurt, who attend various other SSP and other other scholarly publishing type events. Who and what sort of organizations, who should we be reaching out to in engaging in these conversations in order to, building on Igor's comments, who should be involved in these conversations and how can we invite them in? Or how can we extend ourselves out to those communities? Anyone want to jump in? We could back and forth.
Yeah, we can go back.
We could do like a little tennis match. Back to Tracy.
That's fine, I'll lean back in. I think the concept of having more librarians here has come up at several different panels. As a librarian, I am glad to amplify that. Because librarians still do a lot of teaching, and they do a lot of teaching at the undergraduate, but also the graduate level especially, about what constitutes good search methods, what constitutes good discovery tools. And so as we think about how they teach that, we want to make sure they're looped into these conversations. And I have learned a lot in the past 2 days. I've learned about the development of technologies. I've learned a lot about how LLMs work, even though I follow that very closely. So I think we want to make sure that we want the people not only who are preserving some of our scholarly record, but also passing some of that knowledge along to students who become our graduate students, who become our research lab workers. I think we want to make sure they are included in those conversations. I'll just also put a plug in. I was very interested to see the data about research data services, in part because it parallels very nicely data that Ithaca has gathered about who works in research data offices and what does that look like at R1 levels versus R2 levels. There's a lot of discrepancies there, and there's a lot of discrepancies. And those individuals too are doing data management planning. They're doing all sorts of instructive work that we want to make sure they're really included in these conversations too.
Sorry, how do you think we can best involve them? Do you have any thoughts on that? That could be very practical, or it could
I think
be
a very practical, I really enjoyed the panels yesterday with researchers because I don't do a lot of work anymore in which I really hear from researchers. But one of the things we talked about at lunch today is there is not a lot of funding in these spaces. I think we have to invite people into these spaces, and I think we have to pay for them to get here and be here. And I think we have to make that very intentional as we think about being more inclusive.
Also, put them on committees.
Yeah, I was going to say,
There tends to be a lot of little funding projects and committees here and there, and I don't see a ton of librarians on them. When I do see librarians, it's for library projects, but not for publishing or they're getting better and getting included in research data management, but it's been a slow process.
At this conference and some others I've been to recently, we are seeing a more diverse audience. We're seeing people from the research office, we're seeing people from funders, from institutes. But what I haven't seen is people from the production side of things, especially with the research integrity issues. We're seeing lots of things go wrong after the editorial process. So something's been provisionally accepted, and between that and it appearing on the publisher website, things happen. So I think that's one group that seems to be totally not represented, not even underrepresented. And often what we see as well is just one person representing each stakeholder group, expecting them to be able to, speak for the entire group. And we need a plurality of voices. There's not a homogeneous attitude within each group.
And again, easy to ask but hard to do. How should we go about enabling both the plurality, and I think the point about production companies, production actors is incredibly interesting. Any thoughts on how to achieve that?
So I think they've been mentioned already. We need money, we need funding, committees, but also I can't really think of any conferences that really does bring all of them together. You've got subsets, but not everyone.
Okay, I kind of agree with a lot of points already. Well, one group that has not been mentioned, so the scientists that were invited here, those who produce the academic insights that are going to be published, there is a certain bias. Okay, I'm against my survey research methods hat on, where you invited a few people that may look young, but in reality are full professors. I'm fine. For me, everything is wonderful. I have grants, I have students, I have program of research, of security, awards, and so on. But how about bringing in those who are in a more precarious position, junior scholars? And the reason is not just because you will hear more uncertainty from the other end, and maybe you can exchange the types of uncertainties that junior scientists are facing, but also because those scientists are the ones who are more on the cutting edge, right? And they, when you invite a senior person, they are representing the status quo. You invite a president of a society or somebody from NSF, they represent the status quo. But if you want the disruptors to be part of the conversation, you need to bring in junior people who may be in that role, or who may be seeing different, trying to figure out different ways. Maybe some people who are highly critical of the academic publishing industry, period. And then have a debate with them. And so how do you bring them in? Well, again, you need funding. You need to advertise. Maybe there are certain societies for improvement of academic communities. For instance, in psychology, there's a Society for Improvement of Psychological Science and others. They're full of very enthusiastic, eager scholars who do dedicate their time pro bono just to better our fields. And I think having them be part of conversation can be really beneficial because they are the future. And they're the ones who can tell you how things will possibly be in the next 10 years.
So, Igor, building on that, one of the things that I really respected is you described how you were setting up the journal that you're working with, is that you have a pool of editors-in-chief, and you also had space for the next generation, and that I can't remember how you described them, but the sort of next generation of early career, developing career people who are part of the editorial process. I highly respect that. I think that's something that maybe more journals might explore if you're not already. What I'm wondering is, how can we, this community, the publishing community, help support other initiatives like that and bring those people who you've identified as potential leaders into these conversations?
Just to clarify, it wasn't me. It was a colleague who looks similar. I mean, I also have bushy hair, similar age group. And we all both happen to spend a significant amount of time in Boston. So there's a lot of similarities. I don't know anything about light, biophotonics. But as a fellow editor who has been struggling with those type of conversations, so I also really appreciated that insight that you brought up. I think there's not just a conversation about bringing in people from the next generation into the conversation. How do you going to do that? Where do you select them? That's a big problem. But another concern, remember yesterday when I talked about consequences, real worries is that the peer pressure will basically, peer review will basically collapse with AI enabling people from, which is kind of like, it's great that we have now tools that will allow people who may not master English language as well to publish in English-speaking top-tier journals. It's not great when they're not part of the peer review system and they cannot contribute and do the reviews. And right now, we don't bring them into the peer review system because if you look at the editorial boards and who are the junior editors in most journals, most of them happen to be from Europe and North America, English-speaking North America. And so it's just that there's naturally a huge bias towards, then whom are you thinking? You're thinking of colleagues who are similar to you. So there are some journals that try to fight against that. How do they do that? They intentionally try to invite and have junior editors from Global South, from Africa, from Southeast Asia, from South America, who otherwise probably would not have had an opportunity, and work together with the senior editor, because standards, of course, may vary, but they will learn and they will become part of the conversation, and then they can be the next generation of leaders. So that's something that several journals in psychology are trying. I'm not sure about other fields because, again, this is my ignorance, but that could work. But it's challenging. It requires more efforts. It requires more work for the editor, for the senior editors, which means you have to pay them more, because otherwise, why would they do that? Except for out of the goodness of their heart.
So
apologies for, you can tell how I'm managing to get through on a couple hours of sleep.
I just, in the spirit of openness and just to make sure that we hear from the whole room, are there other categories that people have found that should be here, or maybe people from groups that are usually not at the STM meetings who want to say something on behalf of their community? I just want to take a minute to make sure that.
Yeah, it wasn't so much about other groups that weren't here, but I couldn't agree with Nandita's point more that 2 token researchers, 2 token librarians, it's not it's not good enough. I think we need to set up some action groups as well, rather than conferences, because we talk about it and we wring our hands and we say we've got to be better. But how do we create some task force with librarians, with funders, with researchers, with publishers to solve some things? And I went back to I was thinking about the scenarios. You know, how cool if we got the various stakeholders in the room and we did that together. And then from there was a number of follow-ons to build out some plans for how we might change stuff. So it feels to me that it needs to move from talking to task groups and actions, and maybe some of the industry bodies could come together and create those sort of multidisciplinary groups to take it forward. I mean, again, it's going to take effort, momentum, and money, but I think we have to move from chat to action.
I think we do actually have a paradigm for that in United to Act, which is very focused on paper mills, but it's exactly that.
Going to Shelley over there.
So my favorite topic, data. So I think it would be really brilliant for one of those action teams where you should invite a number of different types of data repositories together with you all, thinking about the fact that we want research data to be considered. It's a first-class research product, and you all know how to do that. And there are a number of hurdles ahead of the repositories in that community. And wouldn't it be brilliant if you were the coaches to help everybody get there?
I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't take this awesome opportunity to say that, you know, as many as early career publishers are here in the room, there aren't that many. And so one of the things that we are advocating for in the STM and other early career groups within scholarly publishing is not only do we need to have these kinds of resource groups, committees, and things like that, but we need the help from publishers and especially senior leaders within publishing to actually invest in your people, in your early career people. That goes for other types of scholarly publishing stakeholders, by the way, not just publishers. But you need to send your people to conferences like this. You need to send them to committee. You need to introduce them to people in your networks. If that doesn't happen, we can have all the committee work in the world that we want to have, and we can do all these good resources and put this stuff out. And the work that we're doing is really good, but it doesn't make the impact to help those early career professionals advance their career. So that's my plug. Give people money.
Thank you.
Are there other, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask the same question you were.
Other people who feel that they would like other people to be included in the conversation, or they themselves, you know, believe that their group can participate more, different, or better. Yeah, Roger.
I'm sure this isn't what you really want to hear, but I also think it's important that there be spaces where STM publishers can get together and talk about the things that are on their mind too. So I just want to make sure that, you know, as someone who's not an STM publisher, that I find value in being in a space that is focused on the issues that you all care about. And I think that's something that, you know, is might be worth saying. I'll just note, I don't think anyone's mentioned this. It's quite a bit higher of a fee to attend STM's conferences if you're not a member of STM, which, you know, I mean, I know people have been talking about you pay them and all of that sort of thing, but just like if you, just the pricing model is something to think about as well.
That's interesting. This might be a good moment to move into other
Actually,
questions. Oh, sorry.
sorry.
Go ahead, please.
Oh,
Go for it.
I have one.
Yeah.
Some of the best partners I've had in my career are research computing and the people who run research computing clusters. They build our infrastructure. They tell me what's possible and impossible. They set up the process itself, and they can tell when it's not working right, and they can tell when something weird is happening. And the problem is, it's really hard to pry them out of their offices. I've tried to get them to present because we're doing really interesting work with AI, and they're the ones who are helping me do it. But they're not the kind of people that tend to like to get out there and present their work. But they should. And luckily, there is a new group, the US RSE, the US Research Engineering Society, that's just getting started. They had their first conference last October. So that gives me hope that like we can push them together and like have them collaborate, because I've learned so much from them, and they help all of us do our jobs kind of invisibly. But they have a lot that they could offer to us as far as their knowledge goes. for infrastructure in this area.
So, want to give you all an opportunity to, I mean, this has been a fascinating conference from my perspective, and I'm sure from many of you. Be interested to hear from you what questions and thoughts you might have as we're summarizing. So does anyone have any questions for the panel or the community at large?
Or perhaps observations that came up this morning that you haven't come back this afternoon. So the whole idea of the 2 days was one day of, fire hose, future. Today, looking at different issues, trust, data, and technology. And now saying, right, so what do we do? So anything around that topic, if there's any questions or comments or thoughts or observations.
This is an open floor. Any question is good.
So I believe this was, so I like the concept of destigmatizing retractions as a topic. Oftentimes when we deal with retractions, it is because of allegations of data falsification and fabrication. But I had a question if this was in the public news. I don't recall the format, but it sounds like the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which I don't think is represented here, have requested a list of all researchers who have retracted papers. And my understanding from reading the article is the first request is voluntary. The second request comes with heavier penalties. Have the publishers thought about how that's going to affect your publishing? Because that's kind of implying that there's something negative about the retraction in itself, that you have to self-report. Our office doesn't care if you have a retraction. We don't care if it's a difference of opinion, you made a mistake, you forgot to include a co-author. We only care if there are allegations that the underlying data are falsified or fabricated. Has anyone addressed the China question of how do you handle 1.2 billion people that publish a lot in your journal and the government's just basically said they're going to view all retractions as suspect?
There's a piece I read in Nature, I think, earlier this year that mentioned that institutes had been given Q1 to report all retractions associated with their researchers.
A lot of information about retractions is actually publicly available because of the very good work that's done by independent sleuths. So it's not necessarily incumbent on publishers to provide that information anyway. And Nandita's right, the institutions have been asked by various government bodies to carry out their own investigations. There was a research integrity conference hosted by CAS in Zhuhai near Hong Kong in December of last year, where it was made very clear that the government, CAS, various high-level bodies have a high interest in making sure that the best of Chinese research is represented in the global literature rather than some of what we've seen coming through. So my not gut feel, my expectation is that we'll see increasing engagement from bodies like CAS at trying to improve the standards of what's going on. And I think it's also incumbent on publishers to make sure that those people who are coming in and undermining our systems, and Alan being much cleverer than us all the time, are also not taking advantage of people who are responding to incentives but don't have the means to do it legitimately and are therefore seeking backdoor mechanisms. So I think this is the sort of start of actually and some other very significant players coming into this space and trying to elevate the whole, which is a good thing in my book.
Long as we're on the topic of research integrity, there was I think a theme that I saw this afternoon come up, and I've spoken with a couple of people about. Alan made the point that it's imperative at this point to work together. That if each publisher for themselves try to identify issues with research integrity, we're just kicking the can down the road, and invariably the can will come back and, I don't know how this metaphor works, but hit us in the back of the head or something like that. And therefore, it is imperative that we work together. And some of the conversations have been around, are there, for instance, infrastructure providers or third parties who are not owned or controlled by any of the publishers, but beloved and shared by all, of course, ORCID, Crossref, groups like these, perhaps also other groups, that perhaps can act as validators for signals, for trust markers. The phrase has been mentioned a couple of times. So you can imagine, I'm going to Chris, you can imagine having a a repository have a signal such as this author works at this institution and it's been validated by the institution, or this institution has gotten this grant, or this institution has this piece of equipment, which each publisher could ping, and you get a multitude of signals, and your mesh gets smaller because you have a number of nets that you're kind of piling on top of each other. So that was a proposal that kind of was floating around in some of the conversations in halls I've had, and I want to put it both to the panel and to everyone here. So let's start with Chris.
Thanks, Anita. That was a great cue. One of the things I really liked in Alan's presentation earlier on, he had a slide where I think he separated the data from the models from the governance, and I think that's really important. And as one of the PID providers, I think that we, compared with what I know of financial services, where data gathering and cleansing and linking is quite problematic, I think we're really ahead of the game in having the infrastructure for gathering and sharing the data. And one of the things we're focused on at ORCID at the moment is encouraging every institution, whether it's a publisher, funder, university that holds authoritative data about a researcher, to contribute it to ORCID so that it can be redistributed and reused. But I would say we're not in the business of creating the models on which you would use that data to make judgments about the quality of research. That creates all kinds of conflicts for us. It creates disincentives for people to provide and share the data. So I really like that model of kind of cleanly separating those things.
Hi, sort of a half-formed question and a comment. So I'm Megan Jędrzejczyk. I'm a scientific editor at Elsevier. And I agree with what Anita was saying about it would be great to have some way when a manuscript comes into me that I can kind of verify this person exists. They work in this field. They work at this institution. Maybe they have a grant for this type of work. Anything like that, other than just I have a name and an email address, and verifying all of that is up to me to go in and search through Scopus and search through Medline and find them. So that would be fantastic. But I also want to kind of just highlight, we talked about retractions, and those are, and the information that's publicly available. Everyone can, you can look and see this person's had a paper retracted for XYZ. I know that I personally reject a lot of papers for various degrees of fraud and fakery that I can prove or not prove. But it concerns me that, if I've rejected a paper because I believe there is something wrong with it from an integrity standpoint, there's nowhere to post that. There's nowhere to share that information. Should it be shared? I'm not, question for the group, but what could be shared? What would be acceptable to the community, to the lawyers? Just to help clean up the pool of literature, not just what's being published, but what's being submitted as well.
I mean, that's exactly what I meant about, sharing. And because it occurs to me, like, there are, what about ORCID already, where you log into the system and you have the unified way to log into different submission systems. Some information does already exist, but it's separate from another information, because after you log in, it's really Kafkaesque. So as the author, I tried to log in. I log in through this unified system. Okay, fine. And then the next thing, I end up on the submission page that first asked me to fill in my information, who I am. Well, don't I have that already? I do. So there's something going wrong in that process. So this applies both to sharing information about past reviews. This applies to making it easier so you have a bunch of info about yourself already in the system somewhere. It's just not getting to the end to this new submission platform. This applies to sharing cases of malpractice. I think it's a solvable issue. Bring in the lawyers, bring in the people from technology. The technology does exist, and forego potentially some proprietary rights for how the system is being used, which is why some of the publishers try to keep it for themselves, as I can imagine, because that's valuable data and they want to know that and they want to cash in on that. I totally understand that, but that's not the point of the academic publishing, I think. The point of academic publishing, as I understand it as a scientist, is to advance a discovery of truth. And that is, again, in the purpose of helping the humanity. That's in various accords. And I think we should just keep those high order ideals sometimes in mind.
It also creates a critical metadata mess because you have no point of truth for any given piece of data. Because one profile, I mean, how many profiles do we all have? I have an ORCID and I try to use it as much as I can, but sometimes they force you to create a new one. I've lived a million places. I don't know if they've all been updated because I forget how many I have. So you end up with conflicting metadata, outdated metadata, and spurious sources of truth.
Any of the publishers want to respond to this? Because I know that, oh, go ahead.
Well, actually, I wasn't going to respond to that. Do you mind if I ask a separate question?
Go for it.
Well, no, I'm happy to see if someone wants to respond.
No, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just, when we're talking about trust, one thing I didn't hear that much of today was about peer review. And I wonder whether it's not just publishers, it's all parts of the ecosystem, whether we need to be thinking about raising the profile and importance of peer review at a much earlier stage in an early career progression, for example. It is a part of the tenure promotion exercise, but it's a minor part, and it's usually based on whether you are doing peer review for high impact factor journals or not. And I just wonder if we were to embed the idea of peer review at an early stage, you build trust, you build the idea that integrity is important right from the get-go. Do you have a response to that?
I think that would be a really good idea. But I think peer review needs to be valued more. I mean, the current reward systems, it's very much about the publication output, and peer review isn't particularly valued. And there's things like review of credits, there used to be Publins, all these things that try and do that. But they need teeth. And I think what gives that teeth is that sits with the institutes and the funders. So I think there does need to be a much more holistic way of gauging someone's contribution to the scholarly endeavor that's not just their output. It's their peer review, it's their mentoring, PhD students, all of that in the round needs to be much more holistically evaluated.
If I just could add to that as an editor, it's a real crisis in some fields. It started before the pandemic, and it became even worse way. Editors resigned because they can't find anybody to review their papers. Instead of having 2 or 3 reviewers, or like somebody could dream of having more than that, you can't even find 1 or 2. Even for top journals, you get people, including early career scholars, who don't want to do it. There are multiple discussions about that. I really appreciate you bringing this up, including should we be paying reviewers? And some alternative outlets try that model. Should we be reviewing in the first place? Or should it be also all open peer review or post-publication peer review? So as long as the data checks out and it seems the logic seems legit and it's coherent, everybody else can post that. But it is a real crisis, and at least in social sciences, I don't see any viable solutions right now, except for changing and totally overhauling the incentive structures just mentioned.
And I guess this might be...
I was going to say, the 2 things sort of ping together in my mind about what do you do with the paper that comes in that's obviously falsified in some way, but also peer review. We need to go back to the institutions. This cannot just be laid on scholarly publishing. The institutions have to take a role in this. They have to value peer review. We shouldn't be paying people because this is part of their job. This is part of being an academic. And we've institutions don't value it, and they need to know that this is how you learn about your community. You know, this is your job. It may seem like an add-on task because your supervisors don't value it and the deans don't value it, and they need to value it. And in the same way, I mean, legally it scares me about the idea of sharing things between publishers when we see bad actors, but I think we owe it to our broader community to report these back to the institutions. And let them see that, you know, somebody who you pay, who's on your staff, is putting forward fraudulent research, and it's on them to deal with it.
Just to briefly add to that, so like there is this informal system that existed in my subfield, for instance, social psychology, where some scholars say, okay, for every paper I submit, I commit to review 3 other papers. And and I know a lot of people who just abuse this system. And one could totally imagine that if there was a meta system that would indicate how many papers the person submitted, how many papers the person reviewed, you can flag that. And then you'll solve this issue, like if you establish some kind of a norm within a field. But it's only possible if there is a shareable platform.
Yeah. One quick comment about, I know an anecdotal point about encouraging early career peer review. Daniel O'Donnell, who is a digital humanities scholar at the University of Lethbridge in Canada, started this effort, which I thought was really great, where his class is a journal. So he works he's a digital medievist, however you pronounce that word. And people who take his class, they run a small journal and they solicit articles, and they can also write them. And they also, one person's an editor, one person does the markup. They actually, you know, get the Word file and turn it into XML and add metadata and post it somewhere on a website, generate a PDF. But they also manage the peer review process, and they also act as reviewers. So the students in the class all rotate through all the roles. I think it's a unique example. I haven't seen it replicated, but I think it's a very interesting way in which, to your point, you learn super valuable skills as an academic, and you learn all the parts of the system essentially. I think it's a great example that could perhaps merit some uptake elsewhere. Okay.
Yeah. So, in a lot of the conferences I've been to over many years, the sort of main interlocutors for institutions seem to be seen as libraries. And listening to a lot of the issues here to do with integrity and peer review and malpractice and fraud, institutional practices, we don't have research officers here. And so when we were talking previously about which groups, you know, would that not be a really valuable group to be represented in the conversation? Not just as an individual, but as several representatives, because presumably they hold a lot more sway over these issues than, say, librarians do.
No, actually, I think we did have one person from the research office, because they came up to me yesterday and put me right about some universities in America, particularly government-funded ones, putting disincentives in place. But again, back to my previous point, one's not enough. We need that critical mass. But no, absolutely, we need research officers in here. But again, the research office has many different functions within it. You've got compliance officers, you've got ethics officers, you've got people that are looking at the legalistic side. So you want all of those different subgroups of the research office represented. But no, absolutely agree with you.
I'm Renee Matthews. I work for a very small professional society. So our editorial advisory committee is made up completely of volunteers. So we don't have the issues that you're having with incentives and things like that. So at the moment, it's made up of older professionals who've been in the field for a number of years. And what we're trying to do, part of our mission for our organization generally is to do outreach to entry-level professionals who work in the regulatory drug and medical device regulatory field. So we have entry-level professionals, and we also have students who are post-grad PharmD who are doing research. They're all our members. And what we're going to be doing towards the end of this year is encouraging 2 student members and 2 entry-level people to rotate onto our EAC, and then to be paired with current members who can serve as peer review mentors. And then over time, because they rotate out after their particular term, we hopefully will have a rotation going of peer reviewers and peer review training. So, and I understand that that probably only works in a situation like mine.
Thank you so much. I think we're perhaps at the last question, looking at time.
Yeah, I think what we wanted to do with the last question, and also leave you all with some thoughts for where we go from here. We've been talking about the future. We've been talking about how we're positioning ourselves for the future. So the last question for the panel, and something we'd all like you to take away, is where do we go from here? What is one thing that you at your institution or us as a broader community could do to bring about the futures that we've been discussing for the last 2 days?
So we've talked, I've been very glad to hear the amount of discussion about access, about global access. We've talked a lot about processes and workflows too. I'm a librarian. I'm really focused on preservation, and we haven't talked a lot about preservation, only sort of in scattered panels. And I would invite all of us to think about our collective responsibility in terms of preservation, but also how this is changing for each of us as the scholarly record becomes more atomized. I want to, I think, give props to Shelley in the last panel for pointing out that, you know, as a network becomes more distributed, the nodes and the edges are vulnerable to rot. And we all need to think about that and think about the complexities of that as well. That's what I would put. That's what I would put.
So mine was another collective one, and that is to really revisit our current reward frameworks and the incentives that we put in place that are causing so much damage.
I mean, I mentioned a few things yesterday, so if I were to pick one, I would say you have to be flexible. You have to really bring in the diverse stakeholders, as already mentioned, including technology people, more so into the conversation than before. And maybe ask yourself a question: what are the you know, with AI, hard things are becoming really easy to do, whereas easy things may be kind of hard for AI to do. As a friend of mine, Steve Pinker, once mentioned about a decade ago. So what would be the hard things that are really hard to do for academic publishers right now, and then reevaluate whether those would be the ones that you could potentially optimize to reduce friction. That may be one point to make.
For me, it would be clarify what research outputs are desired and simplify the pipelines to access those.
Fabulous.
I solved it.
So I think with these words, unless anyone has a pressing question or point, we're probably going to close this panel. I just want to say, someone said life is about the conversations you have, and I think these past 2 days I've had some fantastic conversations, and I think this type of group conversation with everyone has just been amazing. So I would wish for the next year that we keep the connections and the conversations going between all of us and the communities we serve. So thank you so much to the panel, and thank you all for participating.